If you ever miss the days when the White House felt steady and respectful, this story will take you back. Because the way Barack handled Trump's insult to Michelle was pure Obama. Smart, steady, and unforgettable. It was one of those events everyone had been talking about. The kind where anticipation buzzed in the air long before it began. The hall was grand, filled with polished lights and rows of people, all waiting for something big to happen. Cameras stood ready, reporters whispered into microphones, and the audience murmured softly as the stage lights came up. President Donald Trump arrived with his usual energy, waving to the crowd, wearing that confident expression he was famous for. Not far from him sat former President Barack Obama, his trademark composure steady as always. The two men hadn't shared a stage in years, and this was their first encounter since Trump's return to the White House. The tension was undeniable. The event was ostensibly about leadership, about how America could move forward in a time of division. But everyone knew that putting Trump and Obama in the same room was bound to be more than just a polite discussion. Their history was long and filled with sharp exchanges, and every eye in the room was watching to see what would happen next. When Obama spoke first, his voice carried the same steady warmth people had missed. He didn't attack or criticize anyone. Instead, he talked about responsibility, about how real leaders inspire hope instead of fear. His tone was measured, but his words carried quiet strength. He spoke about respect, reminding everyone that leadership isn't about ego, but about service. People nodded as he spoke. Some smiled. Even a few of Trump's supporters seemed caught up in the rhythm of his words. Obama had that rare ability to command attention without raising his voice, making people listen because of how he said things, not just what he said. When he finished, the applause was strong and genuine, but Trump's eyes told a different story. He clapped briefly, then leaned over to whisper something to an aide. His face tightened slightly, the kind of look he often had when he felt challenged. Then came his turn. The moment his name was announced, the energy in the room shifted palpably. Trump stood up quickly, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the podium with the confidence of a man who knew the crowd would listen, even if not everyone would agree. But he began by praising his administration's achievements, as he often did, listing numbers, statistics, and victories. His voice was louder than Obama's, his gestures bigger, his tone sharper. He wanted the spotlight, and he took it with force. At first, the audience listened politely. But as Trump's speech went on, his tone began to change. The compliments turned into comparisons, and the comparisons turned into thinly veiled jabs. He mentioned how some leaders like to talk about unity, but they didn't get much done, the crowd murmured. Everyone knew who he meant. Then, almost casually, he shifted gears, and that's when things took a turn. Trump said, "Some people love to talk about class and grace, but they had 8 years to prove it. And what did we really see? Just talk. Even the First Lady. Then she spent more time writing books than fixing problems." The audience went silent. The mention of Michelle Obama's name, even indirectly, drew a sharp breath from many. It wasn't unusual for Trump to throw a jab, but this one felt personal. He smiled slightly after saying it, as if daring someone to react. All eyes turned to Obama, but he didn't move. He didn't frown, didn't even shift in his chair. He sat perfectly still, listening, watching, waiting. That stillness itself seemed to speak louder than any interruption could. Trump continued. Sensing the silence, he added, "Some people were born into charm and speeches. Others were born to lead and make results happen." His words were wrapped in sarcasm. And though he didn't say the name again, it was clear who he was talking about. A few people in the audience chuckled nervously, unsure if it was safe to react. Others whispered under their breath. The tension thickened like a storm building slowly in the distance. Obama's face remained calm. His expression didn't reveal even a flicker of irritation. But anyone who had watched him closely before knew that kind of silence meant something was brewing. Not anger, but thought. He was planning his response, not rushing to give it. Trump went on for several more minutes, switching between boasting about his achievements and taking small cutting digs at his predecessor. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that this was not just a political speech. It was personal. Behind the stage, age shifted uncomfortably. The organizers had not expected the event to turn so sharp so fast, and the moderator glanced nervously at both men, unsure whether to interrupt or let it play out. By the time Trump wrapped up, the air in the room felt charged like the moment before thunder cracks. He ended his speech with a smile and a quick wave, clearly satisfied with his performance. But Obama still hadn't said a word. He simply leaned back slightly in his seat, gave a small nod, and glanced toward the podium. It wasn't a look of anger, something deeper, something that said, "I heard you, and when I speak, you'll listen." The camera zoomed in, capturing his calm face beside Trump's confident grin. It was a picture of contrast. One man loud and fiery, the other silent and steady. Everyone in that room knew one thing for certain. Obama wasn't done. He was waiting patiently, deliberately, for the right moment. When that moment came, and it would change the entire tone of the night, the tension had only just begun. Trump had finished his speech with a triumphant smile, nodding to the crowd as if he had just delivered the knockout blow of the night. But in that room full of flashing cameras and uneasy faces, no one could quite celebrate. Something about the way he had mentioned Michelle Obama's name, or rather the way he didn't mention it, but made sure everyone knew who he meant to lift. The air heavy. It wasn't just the words he used. It was the tone, the smirk, the half-laugh that followed. For those who had followed politics long enough, it was familiar. Trump's signature move to disguise an insult as a truth. To mix humor with humiliation, to pretend a jab was just a joke. And while some of his supporters laughed softly, others shifted in their seats, unsure how far this would go. Trump stood at the podium for a moment longer, scanning the room. Eyes found Obama sitting calmly near the front. There was something about Obama's stillness that seemed to annoy him, as if silence itself was a challenge. Trump leaned forward, gripping the microphone, and his voice took on that sharp tone again. "You know," he said, "some people like to act like they are saints. You talk about going high, but maybe they say that because they've never really been low enough to understand the rest of us." The crowd gasped again. Everyone knew the phrase, "When they go low, we go high." It was Michelle Obama's famous line, one she had repeated during some of the nation's most divided times. It had become a message of hope for millions, and now Trump had twisted it into a taunt. The insult didn't sound loud, but it hit hard. It wasn't just against Michelle Obama. It was against everything she stood for. The message was clear. Her kindness was weakness. Her dignity a disguise. Some in the crowd tried to clap, sure whether to encourage him or to cover the uncomfortable silence. Others sat frozen. A few reporters exchanged glances, scribbling notes with hands that trembled slightly. They knew what this meant. Obama didn't move. His hands were folded. His posture relaxed. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity, like someone listening not just to words, but to motives. He had been through years of public attacks before. He had heard worse. But what made this different was that Trump had chosen to drag Michelle into it. Not as a political opponent, but as a woman, a mother, a symbol of grace, who had stayed above the noise, even when it was aimed directly at her. Trump wasn't finished. He looked around the room again, scanning faces, feeding off the attention. "You know," he added with a chuckle, "I never understood why people made such a big deal about her speeches. Nice words, sure, but actions, not much to see." That sentence landed like a stone thrown into still water. The ripples spread immediately. The audience began whispering. Some frowned. Others avoided eye contact, pretending to check their phones. Everyone knew Trump's words were unfair, even cruel. But no one dared speak. Obama stayed perfectly still. His calmness now felt electric, almost unnerving. It wasn't the calm of someone who didn't care. It was the calm of someone who cared deeply, but refused to let anger control the moment. Inside, though, Nahi was thinking not about how to get even, but about how to respond in a way that would rise above the chaos, yet still strike at the truth. Because for Obama, moments like this weren't about revenge. They were about character. The cameras kept rolling. Trump, sensing he had stirred the room, smiled wider. He talked about strong leadership and telling it like it is. He said that the country needed more action and fewer inspirational words. But by now, most people weren't really listening. They were watching Obama, waiting. Obama finally looked up and met Trump's gaze. It was a simple glance, but it spoke volumes. It wasn't defiant, and it wasn't submissive, but steady, the look of someone who had already decided how this would end even before it began. That glance made Trump hesitate. For the first time in the evening, his rhythm broke. He paused mid-sentence, glanced down at his notes, and cleared his throat. A faint, awkward chuckle slipped through his words as he tried to recover. The moment didn't last long, but everyone saw it. That tiny crack in his confidence. Trump finished his remarks quickly after that. The applause was polite but uncertain. As he walked back to his seat, he looked toward Obama again, as if trying to read him. Obama only nodded slightly, as though acknowledging the words, but refusing to let them linger. Michelle Obama's name still hung in the air like a spark that hadn't gone out. It wasn't forgotten. It was waiting. The crowd knew something was coming. Obama had been silent for too long, and his silence was louder than any shout. Reporters sitting near the front whispered to another, "He's going to respond. Just watch." And they were right. Obama had always believed that timing mattered more than volume. He wouldn't interrupt. He wouldn't react in the heat of the moment. He would wait until the perfect silence fell, and then he would speak. But before that moment came, there was something powerful about the way he just sat there, reminded everyone in that room and everyone who had ever underestimated him that patience can be the sharpest weapon of all. As the applause faded and Trump leaned back in his chair, the cameras caught one last image before cutting away. Obama's calm, thoughtful face and Trump's forced grin beside him. Two men, two completely different kinds of power. One shouted to be heard, the other waited to be remembered. And though no one could predict it yet, the words Obama was about to say would echo far louder than any insult spoken that night. The room was still humming from Trump's words, though the applause had died out quickly, like a spark smothered before it could grow into a flame. People shifted in their seats, unsure whether to clap longer or pretend the last few minutes hadn't just happened. The tension was almost physical, the kind that wraps around you and makes even breathing feel too loud. Trump had returned to his seat, satisfied with himself, whispering something to an aide beside him. He seemed relaxed, almost smug like a performer who believed the show was already over. But it wasn't. Far from it, because Barack Obama was still there, silent, steady, and unreadable. For a long moment, nothing happened. The moderator glanced nervously between the two men, sensing the unease ripple through the audience. Then, as if the silence itself had invited him, Obama stood, and the murmur stopped immediately. All eyes turned to him. He didn't rush, didn't clear his throat or raise a hand for attention. He simply walked to the podium, calm and deliberate, as though he had already decided that every word he was about to say mattered. When he began speaking, his voice was low and even. "You know," he said, "it's easy to talk about leadership when the spotlight's on you. It's harder when no one's watching, when your choices define who you are, not your applause." The audience leaned in. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried a quiet weight that made people listen without blinking. He spoke about integrity, about the responsibility that comes with power. He talked about how true leaders are judged not by their words, but by how they treat those who can't give them anything in return. And then, without warning, when he turned his eyes directly toward Trump, his expression didn't change, but his voice took on a sharper edge. Not louder, just clearer. "You spent time talking about my wife," he said softly. "But here's something I'd like you to think about." The room froze. Obama paused for just a second, long enough for everyone to hold their breath. Then he said it slowly, clearly every word landing like a drop of water in a still pond. "Tell Barron who his real mother is." The silence that followed didn't feel real. Was the kind of silence that empties the air. The kind that makes people forget to move. Trump's smile vanished, his head jerked slightly, his face tightening. As though he hadn't heard correctly, ripple ran through the crowd, a mix of confusion, disbelief, and shock. Obama didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The weight of the question hung there, heavy and deliberate. It took only a moment for people to understand what he meant. It wasn't a random question. It was a reminder, a sharp, cutting reminder of the strange and uncomfortable things Trump himself had said years ago about his daughter Ivanka. Remarks that many had found deeply unsettling, even disturbing remarks that had followed him for years, whispered about in conversations, but rarely spoken to his face. Obama hadn't insulted Trump. He hadn't raised his voice or called him names. He had simply turned the mirror around and forced him to see himself. Trump opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. But even his aides seemed frozen. Few people in the audience shifted awkwardly, unsure what to do. No one had expected this. No one had expected Obama to strike with so much precision, quietly, cleanly, without a single shout. For a few long seconds, it felt like the world had stopped moving. Obama just stood there, his eyes steady, his face calm, letting the silence do the work for him. The power of that moment was in how little he said. The line wasn't long, but its meaning ran deep. It wasn't just about Trump's family or his past comments. It was about hypocrisy. It's about how someone who so easily insulted others never stopped to see the cracks in his own glass house. A few people in the back began to clap softly at first, then louder. It wasn't the wild cheering kind of applause that fills a room. It was slower, more deliberate, like a shared understanding passing from person to person. Trump's expression hardened. My usual confidence seemed to crumble for just an instant. He leaned forward, his voice rising as he said, "That's an insult. You're talking about my family." Obama didn't flinch, simply replied, "I'm talking about truth. And truth doesn't insult. It reveals." The crowd reacted again, some with gas, others with nods. It was like a spark had reignited, but this time it wasn't fueled by anger. It was respect for the way Obama had turned a personal attack into a powerful lesson. Trump tried to recover, forcing a laugh. "You see how disrespectful he is," he said, waving toward the audience. Typical Obama always thinks he's clever. But no one laughed with him. The attempt at humor fell flat, echoing awkwardly in the silence that followed. Obama gave a small, almost invisible nod, as though acknowledging that the exchange was done. And he stepped back from the podium, his expression calm, his voice once again steady. "There's a difference," he said quietly, "between confidence and arrogance. One earns respect, the other demands it and loses it in the process." And with that, he walked back to his seat. No one moved for several seconds. Then slowly the applause began again. Stronger this time, almost reluctant at first, then growing. As more people joined in, it wasn't the noise of victory. It was the sound of realization. Trump sat still, his eyes fixed on the stage, his jaw tight. For once, he didn't have a comeback ready. Obama's words had landed exactly where they needed to, not shout it into the air, but planted like a seed that would linger long after the lights dimmed. In that single exchange, he hadn't just answered Trump's insult. He had rewritten the tone of the entire night. Everyone in that room knew it. The moment Obama's words settled, the air seemed to change. You could almost feel it, like the room had lost all its oxygen for a second. The echo of his final sentence still hung there, calm, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Trump was sitting stiffly, his jaw locked, his face redder than usual, his hand tapped on the table, not in rhythm, but with irritation, like he was searching for control and couldn't find it. The audience didn't know where to look. Some were still frozen in disbelief. Others whispered to one another, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The contrast between the two men was impossible to miss. Obama's calm confidence still lingered like a quiet shadow. While Trump's unease grew with every passing second, Trump leaned forward, gripping his microphone again. His smile had returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No," he began. "I think we've all had enough lectures for one night." He forced out a laugh, hoping to win the crowd back. That was a nice speech from the former president. It's very poetic, very dramatic, but maybe a little too personal, don't you think? His tone was casual, but the edge was sharp. The crowd didn't respond. A few of his supporters tried to clap, but it sounded weak, out of place. Trump pressed on, his words tumbling faster now. "I mean, we all respect families here, right? I would never bring someone's family into politics. Never. That was too much for some people." A murmur ran through the room, the kind that carries disbelief more than noise. Everyone remembered what had happened just minutes ago. The insults aimed at Michelle Obama, and the smirk, the sarcasm, his denial only made the contrast clearer. Obama didn't interrupt, didn't roll his eyes, just watched. Quiet, composed, like a man who had already said everything that needed to be said. And maybe that was what made it worse for Trump. The stillness, the way Obama's calmness made his own words sound desperate. Trump cleared his throat again, trying to push through. "Anyway," he said, "I think we've made our points tonight. Some people deliver love speeches. I prefer results. That's why the people chose me again, because we get things done." There was polite clapping this time, but it felt forced, like applause meant to fill silence rather than express support. Obama then turned slightly toward him, his voice low but clear enough for the microphones to pick up. "You said you never bring families into it," he said softly. "You already did." The crowd gasped again. Trump opened his mouth to reply, but Obama continued before he could speak. "The more you talk," he said evenly, "the more you reveal the truth." That sentence hit Trump harder than any direct insult could. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply true. And truth, when spoken calmly, has a way of stripping away everything else. Trump's expression flickered. For a moment, he looked almost lost, the practiced confidence slipping away before he quickly put the smile back on. He gave a short, nervous laugh. "Well," he said, "I guess that's one way to look at it." The moderator, clearly uncomfortable, tried to move the discussion along. "Gentlemen, perhaps we can." But Trump wasn't done. No, no, he said quickly, holding up a hand. Tucker, let me finish. His voice rose a little too much. I think we've all seen how the media loves to twist words. They'll take one sentence, one joke, and turn it into something ugly. But that's what they do. That's what they've always done to me. The audience watched silently. It was rambling now, trying to steer the story to shift the spotlight back into his control. But the problem was Obama had already set the tone and Trump, for all his bluster, couldn't take it back. Backstage aides shifted uncomfortably. The organizers whispered whether the broadcast could be edited before it aired. We'll cut that part, one staffer said nervously. The president doesn't want that line getting out. Another nodded. We'll handle it, but it was too late. Too many cameras, too many witnesses. The words were already alive. We can't erase something that powerful once it's spoken in front of a crowd. Meanwhile, Obama had leaned back, his demeanor completely unchanged. To anyone watching, he looked like a man who had come for a calm conversation, not a fight, and somehow that made his presence even stronger. Trump, on the other hand, looked restless. His smile faded again. He whispered to one of his aides sitting nearby, his voice low but tense. The aide nodded quickly, clearly uncomfortable. The moderator tried again to wrap things up. Thank you, gentlemen, she said, her voice steady but nervous. Let's move to closing remarks. Obama stood first, walked to the podium one last time, and the room quieted immediately. He didn't mention Trump. He didn't mention the exchange. Instead, he spoke directly to the audience. We can disagree on policy, he said. Maybe we can argue about ideas, but when we lose respect, when we lose empathy, we lose the very thing that makes us strong. The applause came naturally this time. It started softly, then grew until it filled the room. There was no anger in it, no tension, just appreciation. Trump stayed seated. He clapped slowly, his expression blank, his eyes distant. For once, he didn't have a comeback ready. Later that evening, whispers spread that Trump had ordered parts of the event to be removed from official broadcasts. Some claimed he was furious, blaming his staff for not stopping Obama's response sooner. Others said he had thrown his notes on the floor backstage and stormed off. But Obama, he left the venue quietly, greeting people as he passed. He smiled, shook hands, and thanked the organizers. To him, the matter was over, and said what needed to be said and nothing more. By the time he stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the kind of stillness that follows after a storm has passed. He looked up briefly, almost as if taking in the calm night sky, and then he simply walked away. In that moment, the difference between the two men was clearer than ever. One fought for control, the other never needed it. The night after the confrontation, the world seemed quieter. But only on the surface, beneath that calm, people were still replaying every word, every glance, every second of the exchange between Donald Trump and Barack Obama. The event had ended hours earlier. Yet, the moment still lived in people's minds like an echo that refused to fade. Those who had been in the audience spoke about it in hushed tones, like they'd witnessed something rare. And it hidden not just a clash of two powerful men, but a glimpse into what leadership really looks like when it's tested. Again, these of those who hadn't agreed with Obama before were admitting almost reluctantly that what he had done that night took a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't shout but still commands a room. Some said Trump's words were typical of him, fury, unfiltered, made to provoke. Others felt that Obama's response had crossed a line. But no one could deny one thing. The entire room had seen the power of restraint outshine the force of anger. That next morning, news programs spoke cautiously about the heated exchange. But most people didn't need analysis to understand what they had seen. They could feel it. Something about the contrast between Trump's defiance and Obama's calm had struck a nerve. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about character. Obama's final message from that night about respect and empathy was replayed endlessly. People were sharing clips of his quiet composure, his clear eyes, his unshaken tone. In a world used to shouting matches, his silence had been louder than anyone's voice. And that was the real story. The confrontation wasn't a victory for either man in the usual sense. There was no applause meter, no scoreboard, but the difference in their approaches revealed something deeper about the state of leadership itself. Trump's instinct had always been to dominate, to win the argument by talking over his opponent, by turning everything into a show. Obama's instinct, however, had always been to wait, to watch, to listen, and to strike only when it mattered most. In that moment on stage, People had seen two versions of power standing side by side. One believed that power was about control. The other believed it was about principle. As the hours passed, the impact spread. Students at universities discussed it in classrooms. Professors using it as an example of communication under pressure. Analysts talked about the art of the pause, referring to Obama's ability to let silence carry his message. Even longtime political commentators admitted that they hadn't seen such a composed takedown in years. Trump, meanwhile, stayed mostly out of sight that day. Reports from inside the White House described a tense atmosphere. Some said he had demanded to know who had allowed the full footage to air. Others claimed he had called the exchange a setup. His aides avoided eye contact, and on knowing that any comment might spark another wave of anger. But the truth was simple. No one had forced Trump to say what he did, and no one had forced Obama to respond the way he did. It was all there. Two men, two choices, and one unforgettable moment. As for Michelle Obama, she didn't respond publicly either. She didn't need to. Those who admired her knew that her silence spoke volumes, just as it always had. In a way, her quiet strength had been defended without her having to lift a finger. Barack Obama had done it for her, not through anger, but through dignity. In the days that followed, people began to reflect. Many realized how rare it is to see leaders handle personal attacks without losing their cool. It reminded them of something Obama had once said years ago. Being strong doesn't mean you have to be loud. Yes, that sentence forgotten by some now felt more relevant than ever. The story became more than a political moment. It became a mirror. It made people think about how they react when someone insults them, whether in their personal lives or in their communities. Do they lash out or do they wait, think, and choose their words carefully? There was something universal about it. The way Obama had waited for the right time to speak, the way he had used truth instead of insult, it reminded people of how maturity looks in action. He had shown that leadership isn't about who shouts the loudest, but about who can stand tall. When provoked, even some of Trump's critics, while angry at his words, recognized that this wasn't just about him. It was about how power tests people, how it brings out who they truly are. And that night, anon, it had brought out two very different kinds of men. One used words like weapons. The other used silence, like armor. By the end of the week, the story had taken on a life of its own. People were quoting Obama's line, "The more you talk, the more you reveal the truth in classrooms, offices, and even at dinner tables." It became a quiet mantra for those tired of shouting matches and endless arguments. In a way, the whole confrontation had become a lesson without ever being called one. It reminded people that in a divided world, composure is not weakness. It's strength, that sometimes the calmest voice in the room is the one that lasts the longest. For Obama, it wasn't about winning. It never had been. His goal was to remind the audience, and perhaps even Trump himself, that leadership isn't measured by dominance, but by dignity. And as the lights of that event faded into memory, one truth remained clear. Insults may echo for a while, but respect leaves a mark that never fades. It wasn't the loudest man who owned the night. It was the quietest one. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, people still remembered how that silence felt. Powerful, steady, and unforgettable.